Good morning. It's week 6 already. I can't believe that it's already week 6. Like, this has flown by. To start off today, let's start off by, if I turn that clicker on, let's start off, turn to the person next to you, and talk for 2 minutes about what promises we've seen made that are not fulfilled yet. If you haven't been here before, it's cool. Just pair off with someone else who's already been here, can pair off with you. They'll take the initiative to establish that. So go for it. Spend 2 minutes just talk to the person next to you about what promises we've seen made and what has not been fulfilled yet. Let's go ahead and bring it back together and talk about what you guys said. What promises have we seen made by God to people that have not been fulfilled yet, up to where we've been? Okay, restored relationships. That's like everything. Like, everything is about restored relationships. That's the whole thing we're talking about from beginning to end, restored relationships. Now, how are those restored relationships going to be brought back together? Those are the little promises that we displayed. I'm just going to go ahead and turn the slide. We displayed it like this. There's a promise of restored relationship, and then little promises all along the way that show us what that's going to look like. So, what are these little promises that have been made? Okay, great. That's the first one. There will be a seed of the woman who will crush the head of the serpent. But it's kind of like ambiguous and vague, right? Like, it's like we don't exactly know what that means. But we're going to keep reading to find out what else has been promised. Okay, land has been promised to whom? Abraham. What else is promised to Abraham? Descendants, land, descendants, and one more thing. Blessing. Land, offspring, and blessing are promised to Abraham. What was promised to Noah? Okay, no more floods. You're not going to destroy the earth with a flood. What did Noah say to Shem? Noah said something to Shem that was going to kind of like propel the story a little bit more. Yeah, he said God will dwell in the tents of Shem. Or he said he will dwell in the tents of Shem. For the purpose of this class, we're going to interpret that as God. It's a debated text. Think what you want to. No matter what it is, if it's Japheth, if it's God, it's restored relationships. What about Moses? What was going on with him? There was one specific text regarding this promise of restoration that we talked about that Moses pushed the plot forward. In Leviticus 18:5. Do you know it, Josh? Is that why Stephanie just looked at you like that? Okay, yeah. That's one in Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy, Moses says, a prophet like me will come. And when he comes, what would people do? How would people respond? They'll reject him. Yeah, we find that out. But Moses also says, like, this prophet is going to, like, the people are actually going to obey God. Moses also says in Leviticus 18:5, here's the law, the one who does them will live. If you do the law, you live. Which brings us back to what God said to Adam at the beginning, if you eat of the tree, you'll die. So, if you do the law, you'll live, you'll have a restored relationship. But the problem is no one can do the law. And there's sacrifices in the law to show us that we can't do it. So the law is always pointing us forward to something greater. What about David? What did God promise David? I'm going to close this door because it's an annoying sound. Sorry, I'm OCD. What did God promise David? That didn't help at all. Eternal kingdom. He says, you will never lack a descendant on the throne, ever. And then we ended with the new covenant. What was promised in the new covenant? A new heart, yeah. In Jeremiah, God said, I will give you a new heart. You will obey me from the heart. So all of these covenants together make up this promise of restoration that we're looking for to come. That it will be beautiful, and there will be a new creation, as Isaiah described it. Does anyone remember what happened at the end of the last lesson? There was a very sad event that happened. It happened at the temple in Ezekiel. Ezekiel's vision. Yeah. And God's glory equals his presence. The glory of God departed from the temple. It left. The presence of God that was with his people, that symbolized relationship with him, left. We cannot stand 60 seconds of silence. God didn't talk to his people for 400 years. And we turn the page in our Bible and it seems really, really simple. A lot has happened. Babylon has been taken over by Persia, has been taken over by Alexander the Great, has been taken over by the Roman Empire. And this thing is huge. This is an entirely new world. Not a whole new world. Sorry. That just ruined the moment. Entirely new world. And God hasn't spoken in 400 years because his presence left the temple. Then we turn to the New Testament. And we need to ask the question, is the New Testament part of the same story as the Old Testament? That is a legitimate question to ask. Let's go to Luke. Let's go to Luke chapter 1, and we'll find that out. Luke 1, 5 through 7. In the days of King Herod of Judea, first of all, we're in Judea. It's the land of Judah, just so we know. There was a priest of Abijah's division of Zechariah. His wife was the daughter of Aaron. It's a familiar character on familiar land. Her name was Elizabeth. Both were righteous in God's sight, living without blame, according to all the commandments required by the Lord. And they had no children because Elizabeth could not conceive. And both of them were well along in years. Does this sound at all like something we've seen before? We are in a land that we've been at before, with a priesthood that we've seen before. With a God that we've seen before, with a man and a woman who are old and can't have kids. We have seen all of this before. We turn the page, and later on in chapter 2, there's another woman. And this woman, her name is Mary. And Mary, for Elizabeth can't have children. But God says to her, an angel comes to her and says, you're going to have a son. His name is going to be John. And he's going to prepare the way of the Lord. And then there's another woman, and her name is Mary. And an angel comes to her, and Mary's a virgin. And an angel comes to her and is just like, hey, just so you know, you're going to have a kid. And Mary's like, wait, that's not how it works. Like, she took health class in high school. She understands that's not how it works. But she's going to have a kid. So we have two women who are going to have very unusual births. And then we find out about this son in chapter 1, verses 32 and 33. He will be great. He will be called Son of the Most High. And the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David. And he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom will be no end. Is this sound at all like a story we've heard before? This story in the New Testament, we turn the pages 400 years later, this is the exact same story that we've seen before. Which of these promises, it's not the transition I meant to do there, which of these promises does that household of David refer to? A king that will come. This is really easy. Yeah, the Davidic covenant. This child will be the fulfillment of the Davidic covenant. So, is this the same? Is the New Testament a part of the same story as the Old Testament? Yes, it is. These are not individual stories. This is part of the same story. So, the next question we need to ask is, what is the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament, if they're part of the same story? So, to answer that question, we are going to ask the question, who is this Jesus that we're hearing about? And to answer that question, we are going to go to the book of Matthew. We will spend most of our time in Matthew today. So who is this Jesus? First of all, go ahead and turn to the person next to you and read Matthew 1, 18 through 23, and see how that relates to something we've seen before. Okay, so what do we find out in this text? Someone summarize it for me. Okay, so Joseph's just like the woman he's betrothed to is kind of like engagement, only like they didn't break it off. In fact, in order to break it off, they had to get a divorce. Like that's how serious this time was for them. And Joseph's just like, she's pregnant? Like, I know it wasn't me. So like this stuff just doesn't happen. And so he's just like, what am I going to do? But an angel comes to him and says, like we already heard, we find his name's going to be Jesus, but what will he be called? It starts with an I. Emmanuel. Why? What does that mean? God with us. In fact, if we look at John's another gospel writer, and John kind of tells us about Jesus also, and he says the Word, Jesus, became flesh and took up residence among us, and we observed his glory, the glory of the one and only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Like what does this remind us of? The glory of God. Like, we've seen this before in a tabernacle, and on Mount Sinai, and in a temple, and then it departed, and then in Jesus it comes back. The presence of God among his people comes back. But this is what it says. It says that this glory is full of grace and truth. How is that different than something we've seen before? Like, it's the same, but it's different. Like, what do we think about the glory of God before this? Like, it was terrifying, right? Like if an animal touched the mountain, it would die. But Jesus is a person, and it's the full glory of the one and only Son from the Father. This is not just like a little bit of the glory and presence of God. This is all of it. Sam Storms said, God has now chosen to dwell with his people in yet a more personal way. And the Word who became flesh in Jesus, the Word, Jesus of Nazareth, is the complete and perfect manifestation of the presence of God among his people. Divine space is no longer located in a place, but a person. Who is this Jesus? This Jesus is the better temple. The presence of God dwells in Jesus. Jesus is going to refer to himself as the temple. Let's go ahead and keep reading. In Matthew chapter 2, it's so interesting because Jesus is born. And like these wise men, these magi, come from a distant land because they see the star. And they follow the star and they come to him and they bow down to Jesus. Jesus is born in Bethlehem, which is in Judah. They come and they bow down to him and they worship him. These kings from a distant country. And they bring gold and frankincense and myrrh. Where have we heard like this idea of like gold and frankincense and myrrh before? We read about it last week, actually. in Isaiah chapter 60, it talks about this new creation that God's going to bring. Isaiah 60, verse 6, actually. It says they will come from afar, and they will bring gold and frankincense and myrrh. And right now, people are coming from a far country to God's land to worship God's king. Like, this is what we've been waiting for. And Jesus is the better king. This is a baby, and you have people traveling hundreds of miles to come and bow down, and they worship him. This is not normal. Let's look at Matthew chapter 2. What happens is this king is born, and then there's another king, Herod. There's a lot of king language going on in Matthew here. And there's another king, Herod, and he's the king of the Jews. He's set up as the king of the Jews. He's the bad guy, okay? And he says to these wise men, I want you to tell me where this child is that I can worship him, but he's lying. He's the bad guy. And what happens is an angel comes to Joseph again in another dream. There's a lot of dream stuff going on here. There's a dream to Mary, a dream to Joseph, another dream to Joseph. And then what happens is they end up fleeing to Egypt. And it says in verse 15, he stayed there until Herod's death, so that it would be spoken by the Lord through the prophet might be fulfilled. Out of Egypt I have called my son. Who is God's son? Jesus, Josh says Israel. In Exodus chapter 4, God said to Pharaoh, let my son go or I will kill your firstborn son. Israel is my firstborn son. Let my son go or I will kill your firstborn son. If we look at Hosea here, which is where this is quoting from, it's referring to Israel. So this is a prophecy about Israel coming out of Egypt. Not when they did before, but when they're going to in the future. So now Jesus is in Egypt. And it's a prophecy referring to Israel. Then what we find out is he comes out of Egypt. He is baptized. And then when he's baptized, a dove comes down and goes over the water where he descends. And a voice comes from heaven, this is my beloved son. I take delight in him. Was Israel was a son, the son of God, but was it the beloved son of God? Did God take delight? Well, yeah, but also they disobeyed. And then after he comes out of Egypt, goes into the waters, he goes into the wilderness. Like we've heard this story before, right? Out of Egypt, into the waters, into the wilderness, and then he's tested for 40 days. How long was Israel in the wilderness? 40 years. And Israel failed in the wilderness, right? But Jesus doesn't fail. In fact, the serpent from the garden comes to Jesus and tempts him 3 times, and Jesus succeeds every time. Jesus is the better Israel. Jesus succeeds where Israel fails, and he represents Israel. That's what Matthew is trying to communicate here. So we can look at this, and we could keep going if we wanted to. Everything, all these things in the Old Testament that we've seen before, they point us forward to Jesus because he is, this is where it's at. This is what all of this has been leading up to. Jesus is the fulfillment of everything lacking and promised in the Old Testament embodied. We could keep going with what Jesus is the better, X. And there's a lot more than what I put on here. These things that we needed more of point forward to Jesus. It's too much to cover in 1 week. I really wish we could spend a lot of time on this, but we just can't. We're going to look specifically at the fact that Jesus is the better king, because that's what Matthew emphasizes. So, if Jesus is the better king, the king from David, we need to ask the question, what is this king like? So, we're going to split up into 3 groups. We'll put a group up here, a group here, a group here. And then group 1, read these texts. Group 2, read these texts. Group 3, read these texts. Okay, yeah, he's a healer. What else is he?
Provider.
Yeah, he provides food for them. He's very compassionate. In all 3 of these last texts, if your group didn't get to it, it's fine. What happens here? He delivers people from what? From demons, the followers of the serpent. This is a king who possesses the gates of his enemies, which is what we have been looking for. Matthew 9:36. When he, Jesus the King, saw the crowds, he felt compassion for them. Because they were weary and worn out, like sheep without a shepherd. The shepherd language is always associated with kings. Not always, but it's associated with king. Whenever there's kings and shepherds mentioned together, they're talking, the king shepherd the people. That's what I'm trying to say. That was David's job. He was to shepherd the people. In Ezekiel 16, no, not 16. In Ezekiel, it might be 30. It's referred to the people who don't have a shepherd. They need a shepherd. Jesus sees that need. He is a really good king. What kind of people follow this king? Same group, go ahead and break up and read these texts. Okay, let's come back together. It looks like most people are done. What kind of people follow this king? Very humble people. Any reference to son of David in this text is referring to the fact that Jesus is the descendant of David. Who will rule. Any reference to Son of Man that we're going to read is a reference to Daniel chapter 7, which talked about the Son of David approaching the Ancient of Days and receiving an inheritance of a kingdom that's eternal. It's clearly reference to David. So if you see Son of Man, Son of David, it's also ruling Davidic kingly language here. They're humble people. What else? They're like children. Yeah. Anything else? I'm not looking for anything specific. I'm just wondering, if there's anything else anyone got. The people who follow this king, it takes a special kind of person, right? To follow this king, which is interesting. The people who follow this king, Matthew 5:13 through 14, are like a city on a hill that can't be hidden. They're like salt that just flavors the culture around them. What does this remind us of? Does this remind us of anything that we've seen before? Who was supposed to be a light to the nations? Israel. The people who follow this king do what Israel was supposed to do. What was Israel supposed to do with the law that we talked about? Why was the law given to Israel? We've mentioned. Go ahead. They were supposed to be a nation of priests. God's desires for the nations. From beginning to end, it's about the nations. That's what the book of Jonah is about, by the way. It's not about a fish. It's about God desiring to save the nations. These people show off how beautiful Yahweh is by how they live their lives. So people look at them and they say, I want to know their God, because they live beautiful lives. Next, how does this kingdom come? Go ahead and split into your groups and read these texts. These are stories, parables that Jesus told, illustrations of his kingdom. Okay, when we read the Old Testament, we talk about this kingdom that's going to come. How do we expect it to come? In regards to speed. We expect it to come slowly, you think? It's going to come slowly. That's what we read here. What was that?
You're probably going to expect it to come slowly.
Yeah, not at all. There's going to be a king who's going to reign your throne forever. Psh, done. And then Jesus is no, it's kind of like a seed that's planted in the ground, and then it grows to this big tree, and then all the birds come, and it's wait, what? That takes a long time for the tree to grow. It takes a long time for yeast to spread out. This is not exactly what we're expecting from this kingdom, right? One last thing. Please do not turn to the next slide. Thank you. Nope, it did. Gave that away. Okay, what's life in this kingdom like? I'm just going to summarize this because we don't have time to get into it. We're running late, as always. Everyone already read the Beatitudes. These are the kind of people who are in the kingdom. These people are salt and light to the world. And then, these people, they're salt and light to the world because, I'm going to show you one cool thing, because I cannot teach Matthew without going to this. After Jesus comes out of the wilderness, he calls some disciples, some people to follow him, okay? And then in chapter 5, verse 1, he saw the crowds. He went up on a mountain When's the last time we saw God go up on a mountain? At Sinai. So he goes up on a mountain. What happened? I think, picture in your mind what Sinai was like, okay? He goes up on a mountain and he sits down. He goes onto the mountain, like God's presence went onto the mountain, and the disciples came to him. Whoa. If anybody touched this mountain, they would die. His disciples come up to the mountain and hear from him? And then Jesus gives his kingly law, and he's like, my kingdom will be a salt to the earth, a light to the world. And he says, you've heard, don't murder, but I say don't hate. He says, you totally misunderstood what Moses was saying. He said don't murder, but what he meant to get to you is don't hate people. He said, you've heard Moses say don't commit adultery, but I say don't even lust in your heart. He says, you've heard, you've heard it's okay to divorce your wife. I say it's not okay except for sexual morality. He says, you've heard it said you must not break oaths, but you must keep your oaths to the Lord. But I tell you, don't swear at all. Don't make an oath. You've heard it said an eye for an eye, but a tooth for a tooth. But I say, do not resist the evildoer. You've heard it said, love your neighbor. I say, love your enemies, because even the nations love their neighbor and hate their enemies. Like Jesus is talking about a people who are beautiful. This is what his kingdom, this is what people in his kingdom are like. And it's like, I'm not going to ask the question now because you already know the answer. It seems like these relationships in this kingdom are restored, like in Eden. These relationships are beautiful. And things are brought back into their proper order with this new covenant. In Matthew 21, this king enters into Jerusalem. What's significant about Jerusalem? You know, what's significant about Jerusalem?
Well, that's where the king will reign from.
Yes, this king is going to Jerusalem, and he's riding on a donkey. It's kind of unexpected. It's like, why is he riding on a donkey? But if he's ruling over humble people, it kind of makes sense that he'd be riding on a donkey. And then everyone just shouts out to him. Verse 19, the crowds went ahead of him, common people. It's another unexpected people. Jesus loves people who can't give him anything in return. Kind of like David with Mephibosheth. A guy who could give him nothing in return. A guy who was crippled, has nothing he can give him. Jesus loves him. They say, Hosanna to the Son of David. He who comes in the name of the Lord is blessed. Hosanna in the highest heavens. Pastor Tim already preached on this. He did a great job. So we'll move on from there. We know what happens. But this king is opposed in Matthew 23. Matthew 23:13. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You lock up the kingdom of heaven for people, for you don't go in and you don't allow those entering to go in. Matthew 23:15. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You travel all over the land and sea to make one proselyte, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as son fit for hell as you are. The religious leaders oppose this king. They don't like this king. And in fact, in Matthew 12:14, the Pharisees went out and plotted that they might kill this king, because he is not the kind of king they wanted. I typed up what I wanted to say here because I did not want to mess it up. This is the most important part of the story. It's the highest tension that we've seen so far. But the rejection and opposition of this king's authority and rule runs far deeper than just the religious leaders. In Matthew 26:14 and 16, we read, then one of the 12, a man called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, what are you willing to give me if I hand him over to you? So they weighed 30 pieces of silver from him. And from that time he started looking for a good opportunity to betray him. There is a rejection of the king's authority and kingdom, which runs far deeper than we thought. One of Jesus' trusted men, one of his 12 who he handpicked, has decided that he wants nothing to do with this king and his kingdom. He's decided to throw off the king and to betray him to his death. It's Passover. It's a time to remember when Yahweh delivered his people from Egypt in the Exodus. Jesus and his disciples gather in a house to celebrate. Jesus breaks the bread and pours out some wine. And then he says something we would never expect. He says to them, take and eat. This is my body and my blood. And he doesn't want them to look back to the Exodus in Egypt, but to himself. Jesus is not ignorant of the plot to assassinate him. He says that his blood will be spilled, but that he is spilling his blood to bring in the new covenant. This should remind us, well, first of all, he says, don't look back to Egypt when this happened. Look to what I'm going to do. He says, like, we've already talked about a better Exodus that's going to come. Jesus says, Jeremiah says, there will come a day when you will no longer say the Lord who delivers people out of Egypt, but a new Exodus will come, and you will look to that. Jesus says, this is my body, this is my blood, sprinkled for the new covenant. This should remind us of Moses on Mount Sinai, when he sprinkled the blood on the people, and they entered into a covenant with God. Then Jesus says he's going to hand a piece of bread out, and whoever he hands the piece of bread to, this person will betray him. The disciples start murmuring and questioning him, wondering what's going to happen, and Jesus takes the bread and hands it to Judas. Judas gets up and leaves. Then something happens that causes us to realize that this usurping of the king's authority is much bigger than we thought. Satan, the serpent from the beginning, enters into Judas. The plot to kill the king runs deeper than the religious leaders of the day. It runs deeper than one of Jesus' closest followers betraying him. This is a plot of the serpent who destroyed the perfect relationships with God in the garden. He is going to kill the seed of the woman we have waited so long for. Peter sees what's happening, and he tells Jesus he will never betray him. And Jesus says, Peter, Satan has also desired you like he's desired Judas, but I have prayed for you. You will not fall. But even still, Peter says to Jesus that he will deny him 3 times. Jesus goes out with his disciples to the Mount of Olives to pray, because that is what Jesus does. He prays to his Father. He's dependent on his Father. He pleads with his disciples. He pleads with Peter to pray. He pleads with his Father. Sweats of blood drop. Then he comes and he finds the disciples asleep 3 times when they should be praying for him. Then Jesus says in Matthew 26:46, get up, let's go. See, my betrayer is near. Matthew 26:47 through 49. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him a large crowd, armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests and the elders of the people. The betrayer had arranged a signal with them. He said, the one I kiss, this is the man. Arrest him. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, greetings, Rabbi, and kissed him. Like Moses, who the people said, who made you a ruler over us? Like Joseph, whose own brothers betrayed him for 30 pieces of silver. Jesus is betrayed by one of his closest men for the same price. All of Jesus' followers run away at the side of the crowd. Jesus is arrested and totally alone. Peter follows behind because he wants to know that everything's going to be all right. A little servant girl comes up to him and says, hey, you know this guy, right? And Peter says, I don't know him. Another person comes to Peter and says, you know him, right? And Peter says, no, I don't. And about an hour later, another person comes to Peter and he asks him, do you know this man? And Peter says no. And then maybe Jesus is like being carried by the crowd, or the narrator doesn't tell us, but he does say that Jesus makes eye contact with Peter. And Peter has denied Jesus 3 times. Peter runs off crying. He's denied his king. Jesus is beaten by the leaders of the Jews. He's blindfolded and asked to prophesy who hit him. They bring him to Pilate because the Jews can't kill him themselves. Pilate doesn't want to kill him, but he's in a tough spot. He has a tradition where he lets a single criminal go free once a year. So he asks the people if they want Jesus to go free or a murderer named Barabbas. And the people yell, give us Barabbas, give us the murderer. Pilate tries to let Jesus go again, but the people all yell out, we want Jesus crucified. Jesus is mocked by the Roman military who go to kill him. In Matthew 27:28, it says they stripped him and dressed him in a scarlet robe. They say, if you're a king, you need a kingly garment. And they twisted a crown of thorns together and put it on his head. They say, if you're a king, you need a crown. And they placed a reed in his right hand. And they said, if you're a king, then you need a scepter. And then they all knelt down before him and mocked him and said, Hail, Jesus, King of the Jews. And they hit him and spat on him. Then after that, they're done. They put their clothes back on. They put his clothes back on him, and they let him out like none of this ever happened. Jesus is left alone. He's going to face a death by crucifixion, a death by a cross. You carry your own cross of wood to the place where you're going to die. The Son carries the wood, which is going to be used for his death up a mountain where he is going to be killed. They bring him to the top of the mountain where he is placed on a cross and nailed to it, his hands and his feet, and he's lifted up to hang there and suffer and be killed. They put two criminals next to him, one on the right and one on the left, and one of the criminals mocks him. Then they mock him one final time, and they nail a sign above his head so that no person walk by might misinterpret what was happening. The sign says, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." The king's rule is completely rejected. As prophesied in Psalm chapter 2, it says, "Why do the nations rebel and the people plot in vain? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers conspire together against the Lord and his anointed one. They say, 'Let us tear off their chains and free ourselves from their restraints.' The people do not want to submit to this ruler, this king." And then at noon, the brightest part of the day, the whole day turns dark and it's like night, and Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And even Jesus' own Father has left him. Jesus is all alone. He is thirsty. He is naked. He has nothing left. And then in verse 50, Jesus shouted out again with a loud voice, and he gave up the spirit. Jesus, the son of David, the son of Abraham, is dead. The same serpent who killed Adam in Genesis 3 has destroyed the seed of the woman. What was prophesied in Genesis 3 has come to pass. The serpent saw an opportunity and took it. And it looks like he has just won. But Jesus did not stay dead. And the irony of what has happened is that the very plan of the serpent to destroy the seed of the woman was the plan of the Father to crush the head of the serpent and to give his Son an everlasting kingdom. Back to Psalm 2, which prophesies this day. It says, "The one enthroned in heaven laughs at their attempt to destroy the king." The Lord ridicules them. Then he speaks in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath. "I have consecrated my king on Zion, my holy mountain. I will declare what the Lord says. He has said to me, 'You are my son. Today I have become your father. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your inheritance. The end of the earth your possession. You will break them with a rod of iron and shatter them into pottery.'" There is nothing that can stop this king from ruling, because the very plot to kill him is the plot whereby the Father makes him king over everything. It's okay to be excited about that. The suffering servant provides an atonement unlike any other we've ever seen, because he represents the nation of Israel, right? The nation of Israel is disobeyed, right? And one of the ways that a curse can be brought upon the people is if they hang on a tree. If Jesus represents the people, he hangs on a tree. He hangs on a tree and he takes the curse. There is no curse left for these people because Jesus takes it. We've seen a conflict. God's self-declaration of who he is. Yahweh. Yahweh is a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, rich in faithful love, maintaining faithful love to 1,000 generations, forgiving wrongdoings, rebellion, and sin, but never lets the guilty go unpunished. How can God be forgiving and never let the guilty go unpunished? The answer is the cross, where God kills his own son and pours his wrath out onto him and lets the guilty go free because the son is punished for them. Jesus leads his people on a better exodus. Jesus triumphs over his enemies. He triumphs over Satan and sin and death and leads the people of God free in an exodus so that the last one is totally forgotten. He is a better prophet, like Moses. And he crushes the head of the serpent, the head of his enemy. An anointed king from the tribe of Judah represents his people in a battle against the ultimate enemy, kills him in an unusual way, cuts off his head so the enemies flee and the people of God triumph. He goes out onto a mountain. He shows himself to all his disciples, they believe. He goes out onto a mountain and he says, "I'm going to ascend to my throne in heaven." He says in verse 18 of chapter 28 that Jesus came near and said to them, "All authority has been given to me on heaven and on earth." Jesus is King of the world. He has fulfilled all the promises. A couple more minutes. Let's go back to Psalm. I'm going to go back to Psalm chapter 2. How do we respond to this king? Psalm 2:10. "So now, kings, anyone. Be wise. Receive instruction, you judges of the earth. Serve Yahweh with reverential awe and rejoice and trembling. Pay homage to the Son, or he will be angry, and you will perish in your rebellion. For his anger may ignite for a moment, but all of those who take refuge in him are blessed. How do we respond to this king? We submit. He is the king of the entire universe. And we must come to him and give him everything. And if we have faith like a child, we can enter into his kingdom. And if we come to him and say, Jesus, you deserve to be angry at me, but please, please, I beg you, let me enter into your kingdom. He will never turn anyone away. Are you a part of the king's kingdom? Have you given your life to him? Have you asked him to forgive you of your sins? Have you had faith in his death like the better Moses? Have you had faith in his triumph like the better David? Have you understood that he represents you on the cross? He takes your curse for your disobedience, and you receive the blessings of his obedience. If you already have, do you submit to Jesus every day? He is your king. It's not like you get saved and then later on you decide to make him your king. It does not work like that. You're either in his kingdom or you're not. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish. Before we're done, I know we're a couple minutes over. Let's talk about this. At the end of the story, according to what we've seen, Jesus ascends, he goes to his throne in heaven. Is this right? Do we have a full restoration yet? Does anyone say yes? Oh, I feel like that. Like, look around you. Are things perfect yet? No. But how did we say this kingdom was going to come? From the parables. Slowly. It's not here yet. So, we're going to display it like this for now. It's kind of here, but it's kind of not. We're still waiting for the rest of it. For now, to conclude this week, Jesus says in Matthew 28:19, "Go, therefore, and make disciples of all the nations." Yahweh's plan is for the nations. His king will rule over all of them. "Baptizing them in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe everything I've commanded you. And remember, I am with you always. I am with you, Emmanuel, God with us, even to the end of the age." What kind of people is he saying this to? With him the night that he died. Easy answer. Softball. Who stayed with him after all the crowd showed up? No one. Peter denied him 3 times. And Jesus trusts these people to bring his kingdom to the world? What? These are some of the most incompetent people I've ever seen in my life. And Jesus says, you will bring the message of my kingdom. How in the world is this going to happen? To find out, come back next week.